I learned to measure the world in barrels. 4 to 2 gallons to the barrel, a standard established before I was born, before my parents were born, before the oil that would define my life was discovered beneath the desert my grandparents fled. I learned to estimate reserves, proven, probable, possible, the categories of certainty that determine whether a field is worth drilling, a company worth buying, a nation worth invading. I learned that every measurement contains a lie, that proven reserves depend on technology, price, politics, that probable reserves are guesses dressed in geology, that possible reserves are dreams with spreadsheets. I learned that the most important skill in my industry is not finding oil, it's convincing others that you found it, that it's accessible, that it's profitable, that it's real. I learned this from my uncle, who taught me that everything is negotiable: truth, dignity, the body of a 14-year-old girl who doesn't yet know that her silence has a market price. My name is Layla. I'm 39. I'm a petroleum engineer in Houston, which means I spend my days evaluating whether the ground beneath your feet contains something worth more than the people standing on it. I work in due diligence, the investigation before a merger, the audit before an acquisition, the cold calculation of whether what a company claims to own actually exists and can be extracted at a profit. I grew up in Dearborn, Michigan, in a community of Iraqi immigrants who'd fled Saddam's wars and America's sanctions and the slow collapse of everything they'd built. My father ran a small auto parts store. My mother was a seamstress who worked from home, her fingers bleeding from hours of precise stitching. We were not poor, but we were close to it, close enough that my Uncle Samir's visits felt like royalty descending. His car too new, his clothes too expensive, his stories of Houston and Dubai and opportunities like windows into another world. Samir was my father's younger brother, but they seemed to belong to different species. Where my father was tired, gentle, resigned to a life of small margins, Samir was expansive, charismatic, convinced that the world owed him greatness. He'd started in import-export, facilitating trade, he called it, and moved into oil consultancy, helping American companies navigate the complex politics of Middle Eastern contracts. He was successful, respected, the kind of man who sat on community boards and donated to the mosque and was asked to speak at graduations about the immigrant dream. He was also the kind of man who raped his 14-year-old niece and called it teaching. I was sent to live with Samir when I was 14. My mother had been diagnosed with lupus, her body attacking itself with the same thoroughness she'd applied to her sewing. My father couldn't care for me and the store and her, something had to give, and that something was me. Samir offered. She'll have her own room, he said, good schools. I'll help her with college applications, professional connections. She's smart, this one, she could be something. I didn't want to go. I told my mother, who cried and said it was temporary. I told my father, who said Samir was family, that family took care of each other, that this was how our people survived in a country that didn't want us. I packed a bag and got on a plane and arrived in Houston in August, the heat like a physical presence, the humidity like breathing through wet cloth. Samir met me at the airport with his wife, Fatima, who smiled politely and disappeared into her own world of shopping and charity lunches and antidepressants. He drove me to his house in Sugar Land, a mansion by my standards, modest by his, and showed me my room, adjacent to his study, with a connecting bathroom that I would learn to lock and he would learn to unlock. The first time was 3 months after I arrived. He came into my room at night, smelling of whiskey and the cologne he wore to business dinners, and he sat on my bed and touched my hair and told me I was beautiful. I froze. I didn't know what was happening, only that it was wrong, that his hand on my cheek felt like a claim being staked. You're a woman now, he said. It's time you learned what that means. What men want. How to use it. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I lay still while he touched me, while he pushed inside me, while he whispered that this was love, this was teaching. This was how I would survive in a world that would otherwise destroy me. Afterward, he held me and told me I was special, that he would protect me, that no one else could ever understand me the way he did. He was wrong about everything except the protection. He did protect me from the truth, from help, from the possibility of escape. He told me that if I spoke, my mother would die of shame, that my father would lose the business Samir had helped him establish, that I would be sent back to Iraq, to a family that would kill me for dishonor. He told me that I had wanted this, that my body had responded, that my stillness was consent and my silence was desire. I believed him. I was 14 and he was 40, and he was the only adult who had ever told me I was special. The abuse continued for 4 years. Not every night, Samir was careful, strategic, spacing his visits to maintain the illusion that they were exceptional, precious rather than routine. He would come to me after successful deals, after stressful meetings, after arguments with Fatima that I could hear through the walls. He would come to me when he needed to feel powerful, and he would leave me feeling powerless in ways I didn't have words for. But he didn't just use me for sex. He used me as currency. In the oil industry, where Samir consulted, relationships were built over dinners, deals sealed with cultural experiences that American executives expected but couldn't navigate alone. Samir began bringing me to these dinners when I was 15, 16, 17, my niece, studying engineering, such a bright girl, so helpful with translation and cultural matters. I was helpful. I translated Arabic pleasantries. I explained customs. I smiled when executives asked inappropriate questions about what women are really like over there. I wore dresses Samir chose, modest but flattering, professional but available. I sat between men who smelled of expensive cologne and ambition, and I felt their hands on my knee, my waist, my lower back, and I learned to smile through it because Samir was watching, evaluating, calculating whether my discomfort was worth the contract he was negotiating. I wasn't prostituted, exactly. There was no explicit exchange, no money changing hands for my body, but I was part of the package, the proof of Samir's connections, his access, his ability to provide experiences that other consultants couldn't. The executives didn't pay for me directly. They paid for Samir's expertise, and I was included, a bonus feature, a cultural translator who happened to be young and pretty and unable to say no. I learned to pour wine without looking at the hands on my thigh. I learned to laugh at jokes that made me sick. I learned to disappear inside myself during these dinners, to become the competent, charming, invisible girl that Samir needed me to be. I learned that my body was not mine. It was Samir's asset, his investment, his reserve that he could draw upon when needed. At 18, I escaped. I won a scholarship to Texas A&M for petroleum engineering. Samir had insisted I study something useful, and I'd chosen the field that would let me understand his world, evaluate his claims, eventually destroy his power. I moved to College Station, cut contact with Samir except for obligatory family gatherings, and built a new self from the fragments he'd left. But I didn't speak. I didn't tell my parents. My mother had died during my senior year of high school, her lupus finally winning, and I couldn't bear to destroy my father's grief with truth. I didn't tell the police. Samir had shown me the recordings, hidden cameras in my room, proof that would destroy me if I spoke. I didn't tell therapists. I couldn't afford them, and the community ones were connected to Samir, part of his network of influence. I built a career instead. I became excellent at evaluating reserves, at finding the truth beneath the claims, at identifying the lies that companies told to inflate their value. I worked for Schlumberger, then Halliburton, then a boutique consultancy that specialized in pre-merger due diligence. I traveled to Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Venezuela, evaluating fields that existed or didn't, measuring oil that was accessible or wasn't, writing reports that determined billions in investment. And everywhere I went, I saw Samir. Not literally, he was in Houston, growing richer, more connected, more powerful. But I saw his techniques in every inflated reserve estimate, every bribed official, every facilitation payment that was really a bribe. I saw the same logic. The world is a resource to be extracted, people are obstacles or assets, truth is whatever you can convince others to believe. I hated him. I hated myself more for becoming him, for using the same skills, for participating in an industry that treated the earth the way Samir treated my body, something to penetrate, possess, profit from. Then I saw Noor. I was 37, attending an industry dinner at a steakhouse in the Galleria. Samir was there as always, holding court at a corner table, surrounded by executives from a mid-sized exploration company looking for Middle Eastern contracts. And beside him, looking exactly as I had at 15, was a girl I didn't recognize but knew intimately. She wore the same dress I used to wear, not literally, but the same style, the same careful balance between modest and available. She translated when Samir spoke Arabic, her voice soft, hesitant, the voice of someone who hasn't yet learned that her words don't matter. She smiled when the executives joked, laughed at the right moments, and when one of them touched her shoulder, she flinched, barely, microscopically, but I saw it because I knew that flinch, had performed that flinch, had trained myself not to perform it anymore. Her name was Noor. She was Samir's grandniece, his cousin's daughter, sent to Houston for educational opportunities while her parents divorced in Michigan. She was 15, and she was being prepared for the same role I'd filled, the helpful niece, the cultural translator, the invisible asset that Samir would use to open doors and close deals. I watched her through dinner, barely touching my food, my wine. I watched Samir watch her, the same evaluative gaze he'd once turned on me, calculating her value, her utility, her shelf life. I watched the executives watch her, the same hungry assessment disguised as paternal interest, the same hands finding reasons to touch, to guide, to claim. And I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't let it happen. That Noor would become me, or worse, that she would become the me I might have been if I'd stayed, if I'd accepted Samir's narrative, if I'd learned to believe that my body was currency and my silence was consent. But I also knew I couldn't simply speak. The recordings Samir had of me, he still had them, still mentioned them occasionally when our paths crossed at family events, still used them as insurance against my potential testimony. If I accused him publicly, he would release them. My body, violated at 14, would become public property, evidence in a trial I might not win, spectacle for an industry that would use my shame to discredit me forever. I needed a different weapon. Something that didn't require my voice, my testimony, my exposure. Something that used Samir's own logic against him. I needed to evaluate him the way I evaluated oil fields, find the reserves he claimed, measure what actually existed, expose the lies that inflated his value. I spent 2 years building the case. Not against Samir the abuser, against Samir the businessman, the consultant, the intermediary who'd built his fortune on fraud and bribery, and the kind of corruption that my industry pretended to condemn while practicing daily. I used my position in due diligence to access contracts Samir had brokered. I compared his claims to geological reality, the reserves he'd promised, the production he'd projected, the proven fields that turned out to be dust. I traced financial flows through shell companies in the Caymans, Delaware, Luxembourg. I found the bribes disguised as consulting fees, the kickbacks routed through relatives' accounts, the inflated invoices that made small contracts look like major discoveries. I also documented the dinners. Not the abuse, I couldn't prove that without exposing myself, but the pattern. The young female relatives Samir brought to business meetings. The cultural facilitation fees that appeared in expense reports after these dinners. The executives who'd worked with Samir and later faced their own scandals, their own accusations, their own quiet departures from the industry. I built a spreadsheet of corruption, a database of deceit, a financial narrative that any due diligence team would recognize as catastrophic risk. Samir wasn't just a bad actor. He was a toxic asset, a liability that would eventually destroy any company associated with him. I just needed to make that liability visible to the right people at the right time, and I needed to do it without Samir knowing it was me. The conference was my idea, proposed through professional channels, organized by an industry association where I'd built influence over years of careful networking. Due diligence in emerging markets. Lessons from failed deals. A dry topic for a dry audience, executives who cared about risk management, compliance officers who cared about legal exposure, CFOs who cared about the bottom line. I was the keynote speaker. I chose the attendees. I controlled the agenda. Samir wasn't invited, he was the subject, though he didn't know it yet. But every company he'd worked with was represented. Every executive who'd attended his dinners was in the audience. Every person who might have ignored a personal accusation was present to hear a professional one. I spoke for 40 minutes about reserve evaluation, about common fraud patterns, about the importance of independent verification. I was professional, technical, boring, the kind of presentation that makes executives check their email. Then I clicked to the next slide and the room went silent. It was Samir's face. His company logo. A list of contracts he'd brokered, with the claims he'd made and the reality I'd found. Fields he'd described as proven, high yield that produced nothing. Reserves he'd certified as accessible that required technology that didn't exist. Payments he'd routed through shell companies that led back to his personal accounts. I didn't mention the abuse. I didn't mention Noor. I didn't mention myself. I spoke only of numbers, contracts, geological reports, the language these men understood. And I showed them, contract by contract, lie by lie, that Samir had cost them millions, that his expertise was fiction, that his network was a web of self-dealing that would eventually ensnare them all. The questions started slowly, then accelerated. Executives recognizing contracts they'd signed, deals they'd approved, bonuses they'd earned based on Samir's inflated projections. The mood shifted from professional interest to personal threat. Samir had taken their money, damaged their careers, made them complicit in fraud. I ended with a due diligence report, professionally formatted, ready for distribution. This is available to any board considering engagement with Mr. Al-Rashid's services, I said, using Samir's professional name, the one he'd cultivated for decades. I recommend extreme caution. The financial risks are significant. The reputational risks are incalculable. I didn't mention the other risks. I didn't need to. The executives who'd touched Noor's shoulder, who'd paid facilitation fees, who'd known exactly what Samir was offering, they were suddenly very interested in distancing themselves from any association with him. The financial destruction was swift. Companies canceled contracts. Banks froze accounts. Samir's shell companies were investigated, his assets seized, his professional reputation reduced to ash. Within 6 months, he was bankrupt, not poor exactly, but no longer rich enough to matter, no longer connected enough to protect himself. But I wasn't done. I contacted Maya Torres, an investigative journalist who'd covered the oil industry for 20 years, who'd won awards for exposing corruption, who'd never met a story she couldn't tell if the evidence was solid. I gave her the documents about the dinners, not the abuse, not yet, but the pattern of bringing young female relatives to business meetings, the cultural fees, the executives who'd paid for access that included more than translation. Maya published the story 3 months later. Oil consultant used minors as currency in international deals. The focus was on corruption, on fraud, on the exploitation of family members for business advantage. Noor was mentioned as a minor presented in inappropriate business contexts, protected by anonymity, her specific abuse left unspoken. The executives were named, not as abusers, but as participants in a corrupt system, their facilitation payments exposed as the bribes they were. The industry turned on Samir completely. Not because they cared about Noor, they cared about their own exposure, their own liability, their own reputations. But the effect was the same. Samir was arrested, not for rape but for human trafficking for commercial exploitation, a charge that didn't require Noor to testify about sexual abuse, only to confirm that she'd been used as currency in business deals. He was convicted. 20 years. I didn't attend the sentencing. After the trial, after the headlines faded, after the industry moved on to the next scandal, I went to Noor. She was living in a shelter run by an organization that helped trafficking survivors, studying for her GED, learning to be someone other than Samir's asset. She looked at me when I entered, really looked, and I saw the same recognition I'd felt at the steakhouse. She knew who I was. Not my name, but my role, the woman who'd been where she was, who'd survived what she was surviving. I didn't do it for you, I said, sitting across from her, not touching, giving her space. I did it because I couldn't let him do it again. But I'm here now, and I'm not your savior, I'm not your family. I'm someone who understands if you want to talk, and someone who will leave if you don't. She was quiet for a long time. Then, he had recordings of me. He said he'd show everyone if I talked. I know, I said. He had recordings of me too, from when I was 14. They're probably still out there in some evidence locker waiting. I don't know if they'll ever be destroyed. I don't know if I'll ever be free of them. I paused, choosing honesty over comfort, but I know that he can't use them anymore. He has no power, no money, no connections. The recordings are just evidence now, not weapons. And if they ever come out, I'll be here telling the truth about what they show. Noor nodded slowly. Did you ever tell your family? Your father? No, I admitted. My mother died before I could. My father, I don't know if he knew or suspected or refused to see. We don't talk about it. We don't talk much at all. I looked at my hands, the hands that measured reserves, that built spreadsheets, that had finally found a way to fight without speaking. I regret that. I regret the silence, but I don't regret surviving. And I don't regret stopping him, even if I couldn't do it the way I wanted to. What way? Directly, personally. With my own voice, my own story, my own name in the headlines, I smiled slightly at the irony. I spent my career evaluating other people's claims. I couldn't bear to have mine evaluated, so I used numbers instead. Contracts, financial flows. The language of an industry that values oil over people, profit over truth. I met her eyes. It worked, but it wasn't justice, it was strategy, and I'm still figuring out if that's enough. Noor was quiet again. Then she reached across the table slowly, giving me time to pull away, and touched my hand. It's enough for now, she said, for me. Maybe someday it'll be enough for you too. I opened Capacidad Real 3 years later. Not a nonprofit, a consultancy, a business. A way of using my skills for something other than profit extraction. We evaluate supply chains for human rights risk, assess contracts for exploitation potential, provide due diligence that includes people in the calculation. We work with companies that want to do better, and with activists who want to prove that companies aren't. Noor works with me now. Not as an employee, as a partner, eventually, after she finished her engineering degree, after she chose environmental engineering over petroleum, after she told me she wanted to find energy that doesn't require sacrificing people. She runs our environmental impact division, which sounds like a contradiction, a human rights consultancy with an environmental division, but makes perfect sense to us. You can't separate the exploitation of the earth from the exploitation of the people who live on it. We're not friends, exactly. The age gap, the history, the shared trauma that we process differently, it makes friendship complicated. But we're something. Partners in a project. Women who chose to transform their silence into structure, their survival into systems that might protect others. My father is still alive, still in Dearborn, still running the auto parts store that Samir helped him establish. We speak occasionally, carefully, about weather and health and nothing that matters. I don't know if he knows. I don't know if I want him to know. Some silences are too heavy to break, some truths too destructive to speak. I still have nightmares about the recordings. About Samir's face above mine, about the executive's hands on my knee, about the girl I was who believed that her body was currency and her silence was survival. I wake up sweating, reach for the light, remind myself that I'm 39, that I'm safe, that Samir is in prison and I am free. But I'm not free. Not completely. The recordings exist somewhere, and some part of me will always be 14, lying in the dark, waiting for the door to open. What I am is purposeful. I am building something that didn't exist before, a way of measuring value that includes human dignity, a way of evaluating risk that includes exploitation, a way of doing business that doesn't require the sacrifice of children on the altar of profit. I'm Layla. I'm 39. I'm a petroleum engineer who learned that the most important reserves are not underground, that the most valuable extraction is not of oil but of voice, that the most rigorous due diligence is the investigation of one's own complicity. And if you're listening to this, if someone is using your body as currency, your silence as collateral, your shame as insurance, hear me. You are not a reserve to be measured. You are not a resource to be extracted. You are a person, whole and unquantifiable, and your value is not determined by what someone else can profit from you. Measure yourself in survival, in resistance, in the quiet, stubborn fact of your continued existence despite everything that tried to reduce you to a number, a barrel, a commodity to be traded. You are more than proven. You are more than probable. You are possible, in the fullest sense, the possibility of a future that no one else designed, that no one else owns. That belongs entirely to you. See you in the next story.